Doctors of Reddit, what happened when you diagnosed a Covid-19 denier with Covid-19? My wife's a nurse. Just had to deal with a patient who refused to get tested prior to her surgery, so they had to treat her like a Covid patient and needed to charge her for all the added PPE like gowns, goggles, etc. The kicker is, recovery wouldn't take her for observation while she was woken up, so the anesthesiologist needed to stay and monitor her in the room for nearly 3 hours. They are billed at $400 15 minutes, and there is no way her insurance is going to cover the extra cost because she signed a document saying she denied a COVID test. Not a doctor, but my wife is, and a few of our family friends are as well. One of them is sports medicine family. The guy came in, refused to use a mask. Our friend refused to treat him until he masked up. He had a newborn at the time too. When our friend told him he most likely has COVID, he needs to go to Tampa General immediately for testing and treatment. The guy said no. It's fake, he just needed some antibiotics. He left without getting a prescription, called back that night, demanded to be given oxygen. Our friend told him his only option was to go to the hospital. Guy had a severe case of COVID and ended up being hospitalized for a few weeks. He still thinks it was fake and was only a severe flu. My worst experience was when a 2-year-old kid got diagnosed with COVID. His mother had brought him with care of fever and diarrhea. The child was severely dehydrated, and so we had to do a mandatory swab test since we planned to admit him. It came positive and the mother refused to admit it. We were ready to perform a repeat test, and we even advised for the parents to get tested. Her defense was the child never left the house. It's just I and the father who go to work daily. The grandmother babysits while we are away. How can he even get COVID without leaving the house? She had called her husband. He came with 10-15 relatives in a car. They broke a few chairs and then left with the baby. We just informed about the case to the COVID control center. A family full of clowns? That's the only explanation I can come up with. Medical spouse here. Husband works as a hospitalist in a rural hospital 1 week a month. He went to help in the ERBC. They had patient that needed to be tubed who was COVID positive but didn't believe in COVID. The patient's oxygen level got below 70% or 60% or whatever severely hypoxic is, so they told him he needed to be intubated. The patient screamed at my husband that he was lying and that if he tubed him he'd sue. Husband asked if he could do it if the guy stopped breathing, and the dude said, well, that's different. So he waited 15 minutes for him to pass out from lack of oxygen and then intubated him and walked out. Not a doctor, but when my grandmother was dying, my relatives kept pushing me and the doctors to say what it really was. It added so much stress to an already difficult situation and was embarrassing as well. Even after she died, they kept saying things like, what if it was a stroke and she was misdiagnosed? Don't you think they just didn't want to help her? I was trying to arrange with hospice to go in and say goodbye, and my stupid second cousin was sending me YouTube videos about how COVID is fake. I was already not close with these people, and I am glad they are out of my life now. My mom works for an OBGYN who specializes in high-risk pregnancies and births. And he was called into the hospital to check out a woman whose due date was about 2 weeks away and who was very sick. He confirmed she had COVID and admitted her to the hospital until she gave birth. But she insisted it was a hoax and ended up checking herself out AMA. But not before she spat in the face of the nurse, who coincidentally had just completed chemo. That was near the beginning of the pandemic. And I'm so curious what happened to that lady. The nurse is okay. Thank goodness. I'm an anesthesiologist. And in our institution, we're the ones tasked with intubating COVID suspects positive patients who would otherwise die without ventilatory support. And holy hell, there are a lot of patients who don't believe COVID is real. Most of them believe that it's just an elaborate lie that doctors use to label random patients to mooch money off them. Some of them scream at us, in whatever capacity their diseased lungs can allow them to. Some outright refuse intubation, in which case they die several hours later from respiratory failure. It's emotionally taxing having to face that every shift. Not a doctor, but nurse that worked in one of our COVID ICUs. Lady was intubated, sedated, proned. Therapy that involves lying the patient on their stomach in order to oxygenate the lung more effectively. Reserved for very sick COVID patients. The whole shebang. Miraculously she recovers and is weaned down to high flow nasal cannula, still a fairly high oxygen requirement. But better than needing the breathing tube. This spiteful she-devil would purposely cough on us nurses as we went into her room to give meds care, simultaneously yelling that COVID isn't real. And that we gave her COVID. Oh god, this winter sucked. Not a doctor but a respiratory therapist. We had a patient, mother of 3, on FaceTime with her boyfriend denying it was real right up to the moment we intubated her. Guess who ended up with a trach peg and never came off a ventilator till she died? RN here with most of 2020 spent in COVID land. I never had anyone refuse treatment when things got serious. I know some of the MDs I worked with got yelled at. Like the rest of us. But honestly that happens frequently anyway. Some Denier patients lived. Many of which had accepted reality by the end of their stay after seeing what we all were going through to treat them. Some died telling me I was a sheep or an idiot or a liar between gasps of air. COVID didn't care. Not entirely related but with visiting not allowed we would make more of an effort to call families to update them. I was on a non-COVID ward and updating a family member of an elderly patient. They asked about COVID swab results. I used my best reassuring tone to let them know they'd been negative so far and we were doing our best to keep it that way. His response was negative. Well, how about that? And he went on a rant about how it was all a hoax. Not a doctor. Each member of my family had COVID and still believe COVID is fake. The problem is they survived having COVID. So in their mind COVID isn't real. They also believe Kamala Harris is going to assassinate Biden, declare Sharia law, and Obama will seize power with Antifa. So there's that. Friend of mine was a COVID non-believer. Another close friend of ours had COVID bad and he gave him so much about not being online to game and hang out with us and just slept all day to recover. His own mother got it twice. But each time they were mild cases. I believe he said that the second time she got it she was sicker than the first time though. Then everyone including himself tested positive for COVID at his job. His was so bad it almost killed him. Found out he was diabetic too after his stay in the hospital. After he got out he's still apologizing to our friend every time he sees him about downplaying COVID. Edit. Looks like I missed a spot proofreading lol. Corrected part of a missing sentence. Doctor here. I was working in the COVID ICU as a resident physician. We were getting crushed with new patients and the ICUs were overflowing. I admitted this elderly gentleman around 2 AM with respiratory failure due to COVID. He was maintaining his oxygen saturation with high flow nasal cannula oxygen. But notably short of breath and unable to speak full sentences without gasping for air. At this point in the night I had been working about 22 hours into my 28 hours call shift. All I want to do is take a quick history and physical and get out of the room to reduce my exposure. He proceeds to tell me all about how COVID is a hoax and starts rambling on about some Bible passage. He even told me I needed to read the Bible more. I was beyond emotionally and physically drained by this point to respond to the audacity of his comments. He would later get intubated and spend a week on the ventilator. I think he survived. But it's hard to remember. To say this pandemic made me cynical is an understatement. I've been confrontational to these patients out of respect for my ICU colleagues and nurses. They put their lives on the line for stupidity. Essentially I ask all these patients to cure heart disease, stroke, ulcerative colitis and Crohn's since they've figured out COVID is fake. I ask them if they have any thoughts on recent stenting medications or immunomodulatory meds. If they're aware of any medications down the pipeline since they're ahead of me and have more knowledge than me. I also ask them how well they did in math in school so I could better understand probabilities. Similarly, I've memorized a copypasta-esque thing for anti-vaxxers that act like they know what they're talking about. I am not an immunologist at all. Goes something like, Karen, you've done your research on vaccines, correct? Asterisk. So what was your opinion on the PCV2 specific lymphocytes that increase the number of TH, TC, and CD3 positive T cells in the blood of DNA vaccine immune groups? Asterisk. Since you don't know what you're talking about, please stop acting like you do. Asterisk. I have absolutely no idea what I'm saying. But it always shuts them up right away because it actually is medical jargon. Not a doctor but work in the psych area of the emergency department. Needless to say, there's a lot of psychiatric illness based COVID denial and or paranoia. Patients often refuse swabs thinking we are trying to implant microchips. I only bring up my experience to contrast my psychiatrically unwell COVID denying patients to the psychologically unfit COVID denying population. One is because of brain chemical imbalances and the other due to propaganda, politicization, and poor critical thinking skills. It's interesting that the outcomes are similar, if only in this respect. Not a doctor but an EMT. Said patient had already been diagnosed and was being transferred to a different hospital. During the trip he kept insisting he wasn't sick, and at one point even tried to rip off my respirator. So yeah. I'm an ODP and work alongside anesthetists in theaters and ICU. To be honest, I've not really seen anything from patients regarding outright denial. However, I have seen some of my friends on Facebook who have spouted all sorts of lies. That's really disappointing to say the least. One of them, a friend of my wife, works at the hospital. She works in admin and refuses to wear a mask and even bought some certificate off the net so she doesn't have to wear one in public. Anyway, that's being escalated up the chain of disciplinary action. If you have such a bad respiratory issue that you can't wear a mask, then maybe you should stay home. I swear these people me off so bad. I hope she gets appropriate punishment for her refusal. The patient themselves understood and agreed to all treatment. Their son though. Oh man. Calling us every single day to yell at us for testing the patient. Telling us doctors that we were under the government's pocket, spreading lies sponsored by the CDC. The son even demanded us to print out the patient's entire medical record to prove how we were lying. Horrible to see the awful side of humans in this pandemic. I had a lady who was maxed out on high flow, next step is breathing tube, who still refused she had COVID and was holding a negative test in her hand that she had taken a week prior. The COVID equivalent of the Black Knight from Monty Python and the Holy Grail. ER doc chiming in. They told me I was wrong. Obviously. There's no way they had COVID despite coming into the ER for shortness of breath, cough, and fevers. When I mentioned that their wife who was several rooms down also had COVID, their response was, "Oh. That makes sense because she always gets sick." I stayed late on New Year's Eve to see two newly diagnosed COVID patients of ours so I could triage them and consider referral for a BAM monoclonal antibody infusion. The wife was a believer in the COVID and was a bit scared, but the husband, who also had a fever and a cough, would not submit to testing because I was trying to cook the numbers to get more $sign for COVID cases. Then, as I'm literally standing in the rain with an umbrella assessing the wife and discussing how to get BAM infusion, the husband starts harassing me about why won't you just prescribe hydroxychloroquine for both of us? He would not listen to the benefits of BAM for a high-risk patients like themselves. Finally a light bulb went off and I said it's the same infusion President Trump got. He nodded. And off he went to take her to get BAM. Of course not him, since he wouldn't agree to testing. 6 weeks later I got a note on my desk requesting an RX for his erectile dysfunction, which was a new problem for him since his illness. I think it's way worse when the medical clinic is full of deniers. In my city, a large and highly respected medical group was a hotbed of COVID cases last year. They all continued to work with active COVID and no masks. This is a medical group, but the building has a restaurant, florist, plastic surgeons, and physical therapists along with the general or family practitioners. So put everyone at risk. MD here. Still refuse to wear a mask and self-isolate even after me explaining the risk to their family, the public. The next week his wife was in the ICU with guess what? I'm a student, funeral director, and I see families go to the funeral of someone who died of COVID-19 and still deny it. They started out shrieking at the doctors to change the cause of death on the death certificate. Now FEMA is helping with funeral expenses for COVID deaths. Suddenly there's changes of heart. Family members have come in with a sick family member and lied about exposure and/or symptoms, despite a member's testing positive. This can has lead to inappropriate management, delay in treatment, and exposure of staff and other families. The family members then get angry when told to isolate. Edit. Still had to treat her despite her accusing me of hiding the real diagnosis from her and doing something to make her sicker. Love my job. Didn't diagnose a denier. So not exactly this. But did have a patient refuse testing upon admission and aggressively yelling COVID is a hoax. I calmly said okay. Nurse. Since we won't know his status, please admit him to the COVID floor. He became a believer in an instant and requested to be tested. Edit. For those getting their pants into a twist over this. I work in a major city in the USA. And across our health system hospitals, we do our level best to not admit an untested patients to tested negative floor. Such patients, exposed refusing, are marked PUI, patient under investigation, and are admitted to another floor with other PUIs. This floor also houses non-ICU tested COVID plus patients. All patients are kept separate from each other still, in private rooms. Hopefully this makes better sense and ensures that the general public doesn't think we are placing all patients into a petri dish of coronavirus. Edit 2. Source. Since this seems to not be obvious, and the story is unbelievable, I'm a physician, trauma surgeon, surgical critical care intensivist, and director of a surgical ICU that also functions as a COVID ICU during case spikes.